In the autumn of 1396, the largest crusade in over a century marched east with absolute confidence. Knights from France, England, Germany, and Hungary rode together under sacred banners, their armor gleaming in the sun, their hearts filled with holy purpose. They had come to destroy the Ottoman Empire, to drive the Turks from Europe forever, to reclaim Christian lands and cover themselves in eternal glory. The nobles spoke of easy victory. They boasted that if the sky itself fell, their lances would hold it up. They had numbers, they had wealth, they had the finest heavy cavalry in the world. What could desert soldiers do against the flower of European chivalry? But ahead of them, near a fortress called Nicopolis on the banks of the Danube, waited an enemy they did not understand. An enemy led by a sultan who had spent his entire life preparing for this exact moment. An enemy that would teach them the most brutal lesson in military history. When the dust settled and the screaming stopped, the flower of European nobility would lie dead in the mud. Thousands of knights would be slaughtered or enslaved. The cream of Western chivalry would be annihilated in a single afternoon, and the Ottoman Empire, which the Crusaders had come to destroy, would emerge stronger than ever, its path into Europe secured for centuries to come. This is the story of Nicopolis, the battle where everything fell apart, where pride met reality, and where the age of the knight died in blood and fire. For decades, the Ottoman Empire had been expanding into Europe, swallowing Byzantine territories, conquering Balkan kingdoms, and pushing ever closer to the heart of Christendom. What had begun as a small principality in Anatolia had transformed into a military machine that seemed unstoppable. The Ottomans combined religious fervor with tactical brilliance, cavalry mobility with disciplined infantry, and a willingness to adapt and learn from every enemy they faced. By the 1390s, the Ottomans controlled most of the Balkans. Serbia had fallen, Bulgaria was occupied. The Byzantine Empire had been reduced to little more than Constantinople itself and a few scattered territories. Hungary, the last major Christian power standing between the Ottomans and Central Europe, found itself increasingly isolated and desperate. The Hungarian king, Sigismund of Luxembourg, understood what was coming. If the Ottomans were not stopped, they would soon be at the gates of Buda, so he did what medieval rulers did in times of existential crisis. He called for a crusade. He sent messengers to every Christian court in Europe, pleading for help, warning that if Hungary fell, all of Christendom would follow. His message found eager ears, especially in France. The French nobility, having just concluded a truce in their endless war with England, were restless and hungry for glory. Crusading had fallen out of fashion, but the romance of holy war still stirred young noble hearts. Here was a chance to win fame, honor, and salvation all at once. The flower of French chivalry answered the call. Leading them was John the Fearless, son of the Duke of Burgundy, young, ambitious, and convinced of his own invincibility. With him came the finest knights of France, men whose names carried weight across Europe, experienced warriors and idealistic youth alike, all burning with crusading zeal. England sent a contingent despite the ongoing tensions with France. German princes contributed troops. Knights came from as far as Scotland and Spain. By the summer of 1396, an army of perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 men had gathered in Buda. It was not just the size, but the quality that impressed observers. These were not peasant levies or town militias. This was the elite of European warfare, knights in full plate armor mounted on powerful war horses, equipped with the finest weapons money could buy, trained from childhood in the arts of war. The Crusaders were supremely confident. They had heard stories of Ottoman victories, but they dismissed them as exaggerations. How could lightly armored Turkish cavalry stand against a French knight's charge? The very idea seemed absurd. They marched down the Danube in high spirits, capturing small fortresses, burning villages, and treating the campaign like a grand adventure. But they made critical mistakes from the beginning. The French knights, proud and arrogant, refused to take advice from their Hungarian allies who actually understood Ottoman tactics. They ignored warnings about the speed and mobility of Turkish horse archers. They dismissed the Ottomans as cowards who would flee at the first sight of heavy cavalry. Most dangerously, they had no unified command structure. The French insisted on their own leaders making decisions, often overruling King Sigismund, whose kingdom they were supposedly defending. As the Crusader army moved east along the Danube, they eventually reached Nicopolis, a Bulgarian fortress that the Ottomans had recently captured. The Crusaders laid siege to it, confident they could take it quickly and then continue their triumphal march. But they did not know that Sultan Bayezid I, called the Thunderbolt for the speed of his military movements, was already racing toward them with the full might of the Ottoman army. Bayezid was not a man to be underestimated. He had spent his entire reign at war, fighting on multiple fronts, defeating enemies who outnumbered him and building the Ottoman military into the most effective fighting force in the region. He was ruthless, brilliant, and utterly fearless. When he heard that a massive Crusader army was marching into his territory, he did not panic or retreat. He saw an opportunity to destroy European power in a single blow. The Ottoman army that marched toward Nicopolis was different from what the Crusaders expected. Yes, it included the famous Sipahi cavalry, light horsemen armed with bows and sabers who could shoot accurately at full gallop and maneuver with incredible speed. But Bayezid had also developed something the Crusaders knew nothing about. The Janissaries, an elite infantry force of highly trained soldiers equipped with early firearms, disciplined to stand firm in the face of cavalry charges and fanatically loyal to the Sultan. Bayezid positioned his army on high ground overlooking the Crusader camp. He could see their tents spread out below, their horses grazing, their knights confident and unprepared. He studied the terrain carefully, noting the slopes and gullies, planning where to position each unit of his army. And then he waited, knowing that Crusader arrogance would bring them to him. In the Crusader camp, scouts reported the Ottoman army's arrival. King Sigismund immediately called a war council. He urged caution, suggesting they take defensive positions and force the Ottomans to attack uphill. He warned that the Turkish cavalry would try to draw them into a trap, that they should not charge blindly, that patience and discipline were needed. The French knights laughed at him. Defensive positions? Waiting? That was not how knights fought. They had come for glory, not to cower behind stakes like frightened peasants. They insisted on an immediate attack, a glorious cavalry charge that would sweep the Ottomans from the field and cover French arms with eternal honor. John the Fearless supported this view, as did most of the French nobility. Sigismund argued desperately. He had fought the Ottomans before. He knew their tactics. He begged the French to listen, to learn from Hungarian experience, to understand that this enemy was different from anything they had faced in Western Europe. But his warnings fell on deaf ears. The French had the largest contingent. They would lead the attack, and they would do it their way. That night, as the Crusaders celebrated their coming victory with wine and songs, Bayezid finalized his battle plan. He would use the Crusaders' arrogance against them. He positioned his weakest troops, irregular infantry with poor equipment, in the front lines on the slope below his main position. Behind them, hidden by the terrain, waited his Sipahi cavalry. And on the high ground itself, in carefully prepared positions, stood the Janissaries with their firearms and the Sultan's elite cavalry reserve. It was a trap of elegant simplicity. The Crusaders would see the weak infantry and charge, confident of easy victory. They would break through the first line and continue uphill, their horses tiring, their formation breaking apart. And then, when they were exhausted and disorganized, the real Ottoman army would fall upon them from all sides. On the morning of September 25, 1396, the Crusaders formed up for battle. The French knights insisted on taking the place of honor in the vanguard. Behind them came the other contingents, German, English, Hungarian, Wallachian. King Sigismund placed his Hungarian forces in the rear, still hoping to salvage something when the French charge inevitably went wrong. The French knights mounted their war horses, lowered their lances, and looked up at the slope where the Ottoman army waited. They saw the irregular infantry in the front line and smiled. This would be easier than they thought. The enemy had obligingly placed his weakest troops where they could be slaughtered first. It never occurred to them to wonder why a commander as skilled as Bayezid would do something so foolish. John the Fearless gave the signal, trumpets blared, and 2,000 of the finest knights in Europe began their charge. The ground shook as the French cavalry thundered up the slope. Lances leveled, armor gleaming, banners streaming, they presented a sight of terrible beauty. This was what they had trained for their entire lives. This was the moment that would be sung about in halls and castles for generations. This was glory itself, made manifest in steel and horseflesh. The Ottoman irregular infantry, poorly armed peasants and conscripts, saw death coming toward them. They had been placed there specifically to die, to absorb the first charge and slow it down. Some tried to stand and fight. Most simply ran. Within minutes, the French knights had smashed through the first Ottoman line, killing or scattering the defenders, and continued charging uphill. The knights were exultant. See how the Turks flee? See how easily they break? This was exactly what they had expected. Cowardly infidels who could not stand against Christian valor. They spurred their horses harder, racing up the slope, eager to reach the real enemy and complete their victory. But horses do not run uphill indefinitely. The slope was steep, the sun was hot, the knights wore full armor. Their mounts began to slow, sides heaving, breath coming in gasps. The tight formation that had smashed through the first line began to spread out as faster horses pulled ahead of slower ones. And still they climbed, driven by momentum and pride, not noticing that they were now strung out along the slope, disorganized and vulnerable. That was when Bayezid sprung his trap. From both flanks, where they had been hidden by the terrain, thousands of Sipahi cavalry appeared. They did not charge directly at the knights. Instead, they rode parallel to the Crusader line, staying just out of lance reach, and began shooting arrows. The Turkish composite bow was a devastating weapon in skilled hands. The Sipahi could shoot accurately at full gallop, loosing arrow after arrow into the flanks of the Crusader formation. The knights' armor protected them from many shots, but the horses had less protection. Animals began to fall, screaming and thrashing. Knights crashed to the ground, their heavy armor making it nearly impossible to rise quickly. The French tried to turn and charge the horse archers, but it was like trying to fight smoke. The moment the knights turned toward them, the Sipahi simply rode away, their smaller, faster horses easily outdistancing the tired European war horses. And when the knights turned back to continue uphill, the arrows began falling again. Some French knights did reach the top of the slope. Exhausted, disorganized, their horses blown, they found themselves facing something they had never encountered before. The Janissaries stood in disciplined ranks, stakes planted in the ground before them, firearms ready. As the first knights came within range, the Janissaries opened fire. The handguns of 1396 were primitive by later standards, inaccurate and slow to reload. But against tired horses and knights in broken formation, they were devastating. The sound alone was terrifying, a thunderous crack that panicked the horses. Knights fell, shot from their saddles. Others found their horses refusing to advance into the smoke and noise. Behind the Janissaries waited Bayezid's elite cavalry, the best equipped and most experienced warriors in the Ottoman army, fresh, organized, and ready to charge. They fell upon the scattered groups of French knights with overwhelming force. What had begun as a glorious charge had become a desperate fight for survival. Down the slope, the rest of the Crusader army watched in growing horror. The French vanguard, which had charged so confidently minutes before, was being destroyed before their eyes. Knights were falling, being surrounded, being cut down or captured. The banner of Burgundy wavered and fell. Screams and the clash of steel echoed down from the heights. The German and English contingents wanted to advance and support the French, but King Sigismund held them back. He could see what was happening. The Ottomans were using the same tactics they always used, drawing the enemy in, surrounding them, destroying them with mobility and superior positioning. Sending more knights up that slope would only mean more dead men. But the French who had survived the first charge were now fighting for their lives on the hilltop. John the Fearless, wounded and unhorsed, fought in a desperate circle of knights, trying to break through the Ottoman lines and retreat. Some managed to fight their way back down the slope, their armor dented, their surcoats torn and bloodied. Many did not. The left wing of the Crusader army, the flower of French chivalry, had broken first. And with it broke the entire Crusader battle plan. Bayezid saw his opportunity. The enemy's best troops had been destroyed or scattered. The rest stood in confusion, their morale shattered by watching the French disaster. Now was the time to finish them. He ordered a general advance. The Ottoman army surged down from the heights, cavalry on both wings, infantry in the center, moving with the discipline and coordination that came from years of campaigning together. The remaining Crusader forces tried to form defensive positions, but it was too late. The Sipahi cavalry swept around their flanks. The Janissaries advanced steadily, maintaining formation, their firearms cracking, their discipline unbroken. And behind them came wave after wave of Ottoman warriors, inspired by their sultan's presence and the sight of Christian defeat. The German knights attempted a countercharge, trying to restore the situation through sheer courage. They met the Ottoman advance head-on, and for a few minutes the battle hung in balance. Steel crashed against steel. Men shouted prayers in a dozen languages. The earth became mud mixed with blood. But the Crusaders were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and demoralized. The Germans fought bravely but were gradually surrounded and overwhelmed. The English contingent, seeing the battle was lost, tried to retreat toward the Danube and their ships. Most were cut down before they reached the river. King Sigismund, watching his worst fears realized, made the bitter decision to save what he could. He ordered the Hungarian forces to retreat while there was still a path open. They fought a skilled rearguard action, buying time for Sigismund himself to escape by boat down the Danube. He survived, but he left behind thousands of his Christian allies dead, dying, or captured. The battlefield became a slaughter ground. Ottoman soldiers moved through the field, killing the wounded, stripping the dead, and taking prisoners. Knights who had begun the day dreaming of glory ended it begging for mercy or lying face down in the mud. The banners that had flown so proudly that morning were now torn and trampled. The army that was supposed to destroy the Ottoman Empire had itself been destroyed. As evening fell over Nicopolis, the true horror of the defeat became clear. Thousands of Crusaders lay dead. Perhaps 3,000 knights had been killed in the battle itself. Thousands more had been captured, including many of the highest nobility of France. John the Fearless was among the prisoners. His ransom would eventually beggar his family. The only Crusaders who escaped were those who had fled early or, like Sigismund, abandoned their allies to save themselves. That night, Sultan Bayezid walked among the prisoners. He was angry. The Crusaders had come to destroy his empire, had burned his villages, had killed his people. They had insulted Islam and threatened his throne. Now they would pay the price for their arrogance. He ordered the noble prisoners, those whose ransoms would be worth collecting, to be separated from the common soldiers. Then, in an act of cold vengeance, he commanded that the rest be executed. The next morning, thousands of Crusader prisoners, bound and helpless, were led out in groups and beheaded. The killing went on for hours. Some reports say 3,000 men died that day, others claim more. The exact number is lost to history, but the horror is not. Only when his rage was satisfied, or perhaps when his advisers convinced him that the political cost of such slaughter outweighed the satisfaction, did Bayezid stop the executions. The noble prisoners were spared, kept for ransom, treated with the courtesy that medieval warfare demanded for those who could pay for their freedom. But the common soldiers, the squires and men-at-arms who had followed their lords on crusade, died nameless in the mud far from home. News of the disaster spread across Europe like a plague. In Paris, the French court received the reports with disbelief that turned to mourning. The finest generation of French nobility had been killed or captured. Families that had sent sons and brothers on crusade now learned they would never return, or would return only if impossible ransoms could be paid. In England, which had contributed fewer men but still lost many, the defeat reinforced the growing sense that crusading was a fool's errand. The age of Richard the Lionheart was long past. The Ottomans were not Saracens to be defeated by knightly valor. They were a modern military power that had just crushed the best Europe could offer. In Hungary, King Sigismund's escape was seen by some as cowardice, by others as pragmatic survival. He had warned the French. They had not listened. He had tried to prevent the disaster, but pride and arrogance had doomed the crusade before the battle even began. He would spend the rest of his reign dealing with the consequences, his kingdom weakened, his allies destroyed, his border with the Ottoman Empire more dangerous than ever. For the Ottoman Empire, Nicopolis was vindication. European powers had assembled their greatest army in a century, and Bayezid had annihilated it in an afternoon. The victory secured Ottoman control of the Balkans for generations. It proved that the empire was not some temporary phenomenon that would collapse when faced with serious Christian resistance. It was a great power, capable of defeating any enemy, and it was here to stay. The battle also marked a turning point in military history. Nicopolis demonstrated that the age of heavy cavalry dominance was ending. Knights in armor, for all their training and equipment, could be defeated by combined arms tactics, by infantry armed with firearms, by mobile horse archers, by commanders who understood that discipline and coordination mattered more than individual valor. The French charge up that slope, which the knights had seen as glorious, was in fact suicidal. They had ridden straight into a carefully prepared killing ground, ignoring advice, dismissing warnings, trusting in their own superiority, and they had paid for that arrogance with their lives. In the decades that followed, military theorists and commanders studied Nicopolis, trying to understand what had gone wrong. Some blamed the French for their pride and refusal to coordinate with their allies. Others pointed to the failure of intelligence. The Crusaders had not understood Ottoman tactics or capabilities. Still others argued that the Crusaders were doomed from the start, that no feudal army could hope to defeat the Ottoman military machine. All of these factors contributed to the disaster. But perhaps the deepest lesson of Nicopolis was about the danger of cultural arrogance. The Crusaders had assumed that their way of warfare, developed in Western Europe over centuries, was superior to anything the East could produce. They had refused to learn, to adapt, to consider that their enemies might be their equals or superiors in the art of war. That arrogance cost them everything, and it ensured that the Ottoman Empire would continue its expansion into Europe, eventually conquering Constantinople itself in 1453 and standing at the gates of Vienna by 1529. The crusade that was supposed to stop Ottoman expansion had instead accelerated it by destroying the best military forces Christian Europe could field. For Sultan Bayezid, Nicopolis was the peak of his power. He had defeated the greatest crusader army in a century. He had proven his military genius. His nickname, the Thunderbolt, had been earned in blood. But fate had a bitter twist waiting for him. Within a few years he would face a new enemy from the east, Tamerlane and his Mongol hordes. At the Battle of Ankara in 1402, Bayezid would himself be defeated and captured, dying in captivity. The empire he had strengthened would collapse into civil war. But that is another story. On the field of Nicopolis in September 1396, Bayezid stood victorious over the broken flower of European chivalry. The dead stretched across the battlefield in their thousands. The prisoners huddled together, waiting to learn if they would be ransomed or executed, and the Ottoman banners flew over a field where the course of European history had been changed forever. The survivors who made it back to Western Europe carried with them the memory of that terrible day. They told of how quickly confidence had turned to disaster, how the first charge had seemed so promising, how the left wing had broken and everything had fallen apart in minutes. They spoke of the discipline of the Ottoman soldiers, the genius of Bayezid's tactics, the horror of the executions afterward. Their stories shaped European perceptions of the Ottoman Empire for generations. The Turks were no longer seen as distant barbarians, but as a sophisticated military power that had to be taken seriously. The easy assumption that Christian knights would always triumph over Muslim warriors died at Nicopolis, along with thousands of those knights. The battle also had profound effects on the concept of crusading itself. After Nicopolis, fewer knights were willing to march east to fight the Ottomans. The romance of crusading, already fading, became tarnished by the memory of such catastrophic defeat. When calls went out for new crusades, the response was tepid at best. The age of the Great Crusades was effectively over. For the common soldiers of Europe, Nicopolis became a cautionary tale about the folly of noble pride. It was the lords and knights, with their arrogance and refusal to listen to advice, who had led the army to destruction. The stories that circulated emphasized how Hungarian warnings had been ignored, how French pride had doomed them all, how the nobility's quest for personal glory had cost thousands of lives. This contributed to the slowly changing nature of European warfare. In the decades after Nicopolis, armies began to rely less on heavy cavalry and more on combined arms tactics. Infantry became more important. Firearms, which had played such a crucial role in Ottoman victory, were adopted more widely. Professional soldiers who fought for pay rather than glory began to replace feudal levies. The medieval world was changing, and Nicopolis accelerated that change. It showed that the old ways of warfare, the code of chivalry, the primacy of the mounted knight, were becoming obsolete. A new age was dawning, one that would see the rise of pike squares and artillery, of professional armies and gunpowder weapons, of warfare based on discipline and tactics rather than individual heroism. But even as warfare evolved, the memory of Nicopolis lingered. Chronicles written decades later still spoke of it with horror. Poets composed laments for the fallen knights. Artists depicted the battle as a warning against pride and overconfidence. The defeat became embedded in European cultural memory as a moment when everything went wrong, when the certainties of the past collided with the brutal realities of the present. Walking the battlefield today, centuries later, you would find peaceful fields beside the Danube. The fortress of Nicopolis, though damaged and rebuilt many times, still stands. There are no monuments to the crusaders who died there, no markers to show where thousands fell. The earth has long since absorbed the blood, the rain has washed away the traces of slaughter. But if you stand there at dawn, when the mist rises from the river and the light is soft, you can almost see them. The French knights, in their gleaming armor, riding up the slope with such confidence. The Ottoman warriors, patient and disciplined, waiting for the trap to close. The moment when the left wing broke and everything fell apart. The horror of understanding that the glorious charge had become a desperate fight for survival. Nicopolis reminds us that military power is not just about numbers or equipment or even bravery. It is about leadership, strategy, understanding your enemy, and the willingness to learn and adapt. The Crusaders had bravery in abundance. What they lacked was humility, the recognition that their way was not the only way, that their enemies were not inferior but different, that victory required more than courage and faith. In the end, that lesson cost them everything. The flower of European chivalry died in a single afternoon because pride prevented them from seeing reality until it was too late. And the Ottoman Empire, which they had come to destroy, emerged from the battle stronger than ever, its grip on Europe tightened, its reputation as a military power unassailable. The gates of Europe, which the crusade was supposed to close, stood open, and through those gates, for the next 2 centuries, would flow the armies of the sultans, pressing ever deeper into Christian lands, until finally stopped at the very walls of Vienna itself. But that was far in the future. On that September day in 1396, at a fortress called Nicopolis, the only certainty was defeat. Total, catastrophic, irreversible defeat. The crusade had ended not with glory but with slaughter. And Europe would not forget.